So my next question to you is about EV adoption. What do you think are some of the problems from the consumer side and how those problems can be addressed?
As we all know, right, adoption is taking place on the commercial side, but consumer side is the larger market. I think main reason is obviously range anxiety, access to infrastructure. Today, in your complex, if you want to buy an EV car, you're like, okay, fine, I mean, where do I charge it? Can I take it outside the city? Where will I get charging stations? So infrastructure, tantamount to range anxiety, and some pieces of, let's say, evolution of technology that can solve for this is what is important. We've we definitely believe that over time, battery technology is going to evolve to such an extent where you will be able to run, larger number or higher number of kilometers. Every aspect of this space is evolving still.
Right.
So for a consumer to buy, electric vehicle, he I think right now they just look at it as a second vehicle or a third vehicle. It's not their primary vehicle. In order for it to evolve into being a primary vehicle, we need, infrastructure capabilities, better technology. These things will, let's say, 4 or 5 years later, we will see see these things, let's say, in place. And we've also, tried to address this in one of our other white papers that we did earlier, was how interoperability will help this piece.
How do you define
So
interoperability?
commercial players right now, they create charging stations, etc., near warehouses, so
Yeah.
where they need the charge.
Yeah.
Over time, commercial players will start creating charging stations, etc., across other areas, and it'll evolve. It'll, let's say, grow. It may not be, let's say, in the route of a consumer, but cities are expanding. So having said that, they will eventually come in the route of consumers, and those charging stations can effectively be utilized. Charging stations, swapping stations, whatever let's say, energy distribution plays will can be utilized for consumers as well.
Right.
It's something that is potentially possible, and how we see things may evolve. We'll obviously have a mix of technologies evolved. So consumers will over time have choices whether they want vehicles that swap their batteries, whether they want vehicles that charge their batteries. Different price points, I believe, may may be present, but still obviously speculation to see how this industry grows.
Right. So range anxiety is one thing which you highlighted, and second is the charging infra.
Yeah.
So a lot of
Charging, swapping, whatever.
swapping.
Yeah.
So investment will come from
And I think,
private as well as other.
yeah, I mean, the other aspect is charging infrastructure. Let's say CPOs today are, let's say, operating at less than 5% capacity, which is not viable. If they've operated that capacity, how can they build a business out of it?
Right.
And that primarily means that, yes, they still can, eventually have more, vehicles charge on their platform. Like all five-star hotels, etc., have, charging points, but we still don't have, I mean, charging points in every buildings, every complex.
Yeah.
So there's still a gap now, but you will always see the charging stations, etc., at near warehouses are utilized. That's because of the use case. The other aspect is obviously the sweating of the asset. For a consumer, the vehicle runtime is very low compared to a
Commercial vehicle.
right? And that can over time be addressed by battery prices falling, better technology, cheaper vehicles. MG has already launched a very interesting program that they did. Is they're saying that you buy the vehicle and battery is is a service, or we are we're not selling you the battery, though the battery is part of the vehicle.
Okay.
Interesting step, but I probably feel in the right direction. I may be wrong, I may be right, but this is this probably can create a base for swapping infrastructure for the four wheelers, etc.
For personal vehicles. So after a few
Yes.
years, I can go back to MG and they can replace that battery.
No. So the way I would like to look at it is that the reason they don't want you to purchase the battery is because the battery is not yours. Right? Now, when you do not purchase the battery, the problem is if you have a swapping infra for larger vehicles. And I don't know if you've heard of NEO,
I think I've heard of it.
right? NEO has swapping infra. They've now opened one in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, the first one, and then they're opening in Dubai as well. China obviously has multiple. Ampel in the US also does this. Right? These technologies are under, I mean, NEO's technology is developed, but technologies in India also are under development in this stage. The fact being that how is this going to affect the consumer behavior? Now, first things first, if I buy a vehicle, I will say this battery pack is mine, right? I mean, I own this battery pack. Now, but once it goes into the swapping ecosystem, you can't have control over,
Yeah.
your coded battery pack.
Yeah.
So therefore, not selling the battery pack allows you to create for this. Though the motivation may be very different. I'm not aware of obviously internal workings of MG, but the motivations may probably be because a cost advantage, etc. That we're selling a cheaper vehicle, but this can set the tone for creating this.
Got it. Regarding your vision at Carrot and EV2, because I think Carrot you're doing much broader things.
Yeah.
So anything you want to highlight, what kind of sectors you're focusing on, etc.
So, first fund, we obviously were a little more focused, but as I said, we're, three phases, but the phase one of adoption, and we were focused on investing in the mobility space actively. Second fund, where, where with Carrot, where we're investing across, again, mobility, distribution, and employment is because, let's say, logistics supply chain or transportation industry requires a lot of manpower. So employment or jobs is very key, and we need upskilling for everything with AI coming into.
Yeah.
And having said that, mobility, we're focusing on the components piece. We're focusing on new technology that will help battery recycling plays to, let's say, the underlying technology players that can help, set the base for the EV ecosystem now. That's where the thought process is. And distribution, as I said, use case, multiple pieces. I mean, we're a large country.
Right.
We have to move goods from one end to the other. There is no way that we can ignore distribution.
And what are some of your major bets in logistics and supply chain so far?
How we focused on supply chain was, as I mentioned, is plant, yard, first mile, mid mile, and last mile.
Yes.
We kind of took again an ecosystem approach. Pieces of logistics, transportation, and agri supply chain. So each piece we've done one investment. For the plant yard, and first mile, we invested in a company called Nmobile, which is a software-based SaaS product that solves for multimodal logistics within plant as well as your first mile. So we believe that that kind of segment cannot be disrupted by, let's say, physical vehicle category players.
Okay.
Because a lot of the vehicles are owned by the plant manufacturers, etc., and those tie-ups are there. We need to create efficiency in that space. In the last mile segment, we invested in a company called Kogos, which does intracity deliveries. He has about, operates around approximately across 300 cities and has about 18,000 drivers on his platform.
Okay.
So, he's enterprise, takes enterprise level contracts and gives it out in each of these cities, wherever, for Flipkart, Amazon, you know, Coca-Cola, etc. So,
When just to add to this, whenever a founder talks about creating a platform, right? I think it's always more difficult to judge the long-term value, etc., etc., because you're still discussing at idea stage. But when you're creating a platform, it's network effect combined into other things, plus, 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 right? So how do you judge the founder? At least, obviously, execution and all those things we discussed, but especially particularly for platforms, because now whenever I see a pitch deck from, let's say, EV founder at early stage, they want to touch fleet, they want to charging, they want to touch software, they want to touch all these 4 or 5 different things. And I always get confused that shouldn't you be focusing on a niche? Maybe EV is different, but
no, I second that thought, right? You can't focus on all pieces.
yeah,
You have to focus on one piece, and tie up with other players for the other pieces. The issue with this with the EV industry in itself is that without the ecosystem it cannot function. Right? Supposing you create a vehicle, you don't have charging. Supposing you create a vehicle, you don't have, let's say, good battery technology, or powertrain. So, but having said that, ecosystem is imperative. We definitely need the ecosystem. So one player needs the other player. Now, like, for two-wheelers today, battery swapping is very relevant. They find it important to have battery swapping players, but they also feel that charging will reduce their cost.
right,
So they will use what they have today in the market, evolve, but that doesn't mean that they're going to go set up their own charging stations. So over time, you will see that each segment or each piece has enough meat for any founder. But if you try to do everything, say that I'm going to do a full stack, one, the amount of capital you will require may not be available initially. You may not even get it later. And your scale is stunted. And for an investor like us, scale is equally important.
yeah,
Right?
because you're scattered.
Yeah, so if you're scattered, you won't scale. But for VCs, primarily, right, scale is important. I cannot invest in a business that is basically a lifestyle business that you're building. I'm happy with slow growth, 15% a year, 20% a year. I mean, if you really look at it, it's very difficult for VCs to make money on that kind of growth.
Yeah,
So I think the dynamics of trying to do everything will not fit into the ambit of a VC investor.
yeah. And what are your perspectives on, because you've also touched agri-tech and consumer in the past before the EV focus. I'm not sure if you're still doing that.
So in the agri space, we invest in agri supply chain.
Okay.
I mean,
This was through Carrot.
no, through the EV2 vehicle.
Okay.
A company called Fambo. What they typically do is they source from farmers and are supplying to QSRs.
So input side.
Yeah,
Sorry. So they take the harvest.
yeah.
Okay. So
They
the output
process it,
Okay.
basically, pre-cut, let's say value added, and then they supply to QSRs
Okay.
as needed, right? I mean, Burger King probably requires a certain size of tomato
Yeah.
cut.
Same for McDonald's.
Yeah. So similar. I mean, so it's a niche category to target. We looked at a lot of players in this space. We try to see whether it helps in the consumer. Like, can you create a consumer play from your sourcing? Which I feel is very difficult, because the moment a consumer comes into the angle, the capital required changes, because you need to I mean, you're looking at very different metrics. You you need to, let's say, acquire customers on a regular basis. It changes the entire dynamics of, let's say, your investment.
Yeah.
But B2B plays are very different in in that
Yeah.
aspect. They're like you crack one store, you can replicate that entire model through that entire store within, that region. So your processes can be standardized. And if your processes are standardized, streamlined, you can achieve economies of scale, become profitable. Dynamics are very different.
Right, right. Because in consumer space, there's no such diatomic unit is very different, right? Because
Yes,
every situation is
yes,
different,
yes,
even in the same geography.
yes.
Yeah. So from consumption side, um we were just debating this with our team yesterday or day before yesterday. So we were looking at probably G20 economies and looking at consumption as percentage of their GDP, right? So US is around 70% of their GDP is consumption. Second is India. In terms of proportion, we are about 60%, 65% of total GDP is consumption in India, right? So I don't know for investors, early stage investors, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because we are still a lower middle income country, uh, largely services driven. Our manufacturing still remains very weak. Uh, so we are more prone to demand side shocks because consumption is 60% of the GDP. So anything disturbing that can have multiple ripple effects very easily. So that's what you're trying to understand. So from early stage consumer investment perspective, uh, how do you look at that? That consumption is contributing a large part of our economy.
So we've not been looking at it for a few years right now,
Okay.
because of, obviously focusing on the B2B space. But consumption is, I mean, we are 1.4 billion people. The mistake that we always make is, is that the entire, let's say, consumption story there. I think the metros tier one, tier two is probably where it is. Below that, it changes. The dynamics are very different.
Yeah.
Your product profile is very different. So if we need to, and just an over the top, kind of thought process here is, if we really need to target that, you need to have multiple product categories that can cater to those demands and different price points. Though today everybody has a mobile phone, so I think that's, huge advantage. UPI is there, so we definitely have the makings of reaching those customers, or let's say makings of increasing consumption in India. But what and how are the two questions that are still to be answered, right? What product will work and how will that product reach you?
I'll ask you two questions. Uh, One is what is your outlook on the early stage investments in EV ecosystem in India? And second is any advice for founders who want to come into this as a first time founders? Let's assume they're coming without any experience.
What is our viewpoint? I think we've spoken about that
Yeah, yeah.
a number of times in today's conversation. Is where do we, see how this industry is going to evolve, etc. So I continue to think in that manner that yes, we feel that the evolution will go from commercial to consumer over the next 15 years. It's going to take time. If and let me not say if, I say when the industry, kind of matures. We've seen green shoots of that, so we're pretty happy with 7% penetration today. And as I mentioned earlier as well, that there is huge demand. Supply is the constraint. So I think we're still trying to meet the supply demand gap, which is great for the industry today. So definitely shows that there is potential for this industry to grow. Founders who are coming to now, whether they're first-time founders or whether they're first-time founders in this industry, there's two different aspects.
Both. Let's cover
But
both.
I think that founders who want to target this industry need to be very focused on creating something that has IP and not look at, just run-of-the-mill business models or run-of-the-mill kind of, products. It is an product asset-led, industry. I mean, the vehicle is an asset. You have to understand the asset. Everything around the asset is what is important. So whatever you build, I mean, there is some sort of, let's say, operational capability that you can build over time. But I think that piece is over, as far as I understand. There are people who had to build certain capabilities in certain segments, have already built it. I do understand that, yes, India is still a very large market. You may be able to target a different, let's say, geographical location, create a substantial business and try and capture it. But that will result in price wars, maybe consolidation, either or, right? What's more important or what's more relevant is that if you're actually going to start targeting a product category, then are you building IP around this? And that is going to be extremely relevant for success or failure.
Got it. That's helpful.
Yeah, it's one of the first questions we pretty much almost ask.
Right.
If they come with the product, we say, "What is the IP?" So it's pretty apparent that we're focused on having IP around the product.
Right. Yeah. I think that's also tells you a bit about, how hard have they thought about the problem? Have they tried to solve anything real?
Yeah,
Versus just, flipping something or creating a front end and just trying to make quick buck.
yeah.
That's a different mindset.
Yeah, there are various business models, right? I mean, there are, as you mentioned earlier as well, right? There are multiple pieces of
Yeah.
this segment industry itself. So multiple segments will have different kinds of product plays. Now, whether it's physical product or let's say tech product, it just depends.
Well, yeah, thank you for sitting down with us and coming down to our office and having this conversation. Hopefully, in future, we'll sit again and discuss more in depth about EV.
Well, yes, absolutely. We will have this recording. We'll know some things how they evolve. And thank you, Kulmani, for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Thank you.